The Cherokee, a nation's journey through time. Welcome. Tonight, we are going to talk about the Cherokee people, one of the most remarkable indigenous nations of North America, whose story spans thousands of years and encompasses triumph, tragedy, resilience, and renewal. This is a tale of a people who built a sophisticated civilization in the mountains and valleys of the Southeast, who faced the devastating onslaught of colonization with both resistance and adaptation, who endured one of history's greatest injustices, and who ultimately survived to rebuild and preserve their culture for future generations. The story of the Cherokee is not merely a chronicle of events, but a testament to the enduring strength of a people's identity, the power of cultural memory, and the profound connection between a nation and its ancestral lands. It is a story that touches upon universal themes of home and displacement, tradition and change, loss and perseverance. As we journey through Cherokee history tonight, we will witness the evolution of a great nation, explore the richness of their culture, confront the darkness of their persecution, and celebrate their remarkable survival against overwhelming odds. Let us begin at the beginning, in the misty mountains and river valleys where the Cherokee people first emerged as a distinct nation. Ancient origins and early history. The Cherokee call themselves Ani-Yunwia, which translates to the principal people, or the real people. This name reflects their understanding of themselves as a chosen people, placed by the Creator in the beautiful mountains and valleys that would become their homeland. The origins of the Cherokee people stretch back into the depths of prehistory, to times when the world was young and the mountains were being formed. According to archaeological evidence, the ancestors of the Cherokee were part of the broader Mississippian culture that flourished across the southeastern United States from approximately 800 CE to 1600 CE. These were sophisticated societies that built impressive earthen mounds, established extensive trade networks, and developed complex social and political structures. The Cherokee emerged from this cultural matrix, gradually developing their own distinct identity, language, and traditions in the mountain regions of what would later be called the Southern Appalachians. The traditional Cherokee homeland was vast and beautiful, encompassing approximately 140,000 square miles across parts of what are now 8 states: North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, Tennessee, Kentucky, Virginia, and West Virginia. This was a land of extraordinary natural wealth and diversity, featuring towering mountains, fertile valleys, clear rushing rivers, dense forests, and abundant wildlife. The Great Smoky Mountains stood at the heart of this territory, their peaks often shrouded in the mist that gave them their name. Cherokee creation stories tell a different account of their origins, one rooted in spiritual truth rather than archaeological evidence. These stories speak of a time when the earth was covered with water and the animals lived in the sky realm above. The world below was soft and wet, newly emerged from the great water. The great buzzard flew down to prepare the earth for habitation, and where his wings struck the ground, valleys were formed. Where his wings turned upward, mountains rose. This is how the Cherokee explain the mountainous character of their homeland. When the earth was ready, the first man and woman were lowered down on a rope. Their descendants became the Cherokee people, placed specifically in the mountain country as their destined home. This connection to the land was not merely practical or economic, but deeply spiritual and defining. The mountains, rivers, forests, and valleys were not just resources to be exploited, but sacred spaces filled with meaning, home to spirits and ancestors, woven into the very fabric of Cherokee identity. The Cherokee language belongs to the Iroquoian language family, which connects them linguistically to nations like the Mohawk, Oneida, and Seneca of the northeastern United States. This linguistic connection has led scholars to theorize that the Cherokee ancestors may have migrated from the north at some point in the distant past, eventually settling in the southern mountains and developing their distinct culture over many centuries. The Cherokee language itself is polysynthetic, meaning that long words are formed by combining many different elements, allowing for great precision and nuance in expression. By the time European contact began in the 16th century, the Cherokee had developed a rich and complex society. They lived in permanent towns that could house hundreds of people, with houses arranged around central plazas where councils were held and ceremonies performed. Their homes were well constructed, featuring a framework of wooden poles covered with wattle and daub, woven branches plastered with mud and clay. These houses were remarkably warm in winter and cool in summer, designed with great practical wisdom gained over generations of experience in the mountain climate. Cherokee towns were typically located near rivers or streams, both for the obvious practical benefits of water access and because waterways played important spiritual and practical roles in Cherokee life. The rivers provided fish, transportation routes, and water for crops, while also serving as boundaries between different territories and as paths of spiritual significance. Each town was politically autonomous, governed by its own council and leaders, though towns were connected through networks of kinship, trade, and shared cultural identity. The Cherokee practiced agriculture with great skill and knowledge, growing what they called the Three Sisters: corn, beans, and squash, which were cultivated together in a complementary planting system that maximized yield and maintained soil fertility. Corn was particularly central to Cherokee life, featuring prominently in their diet, ceremonies, and mythology. The green corn ceremony, held annually when the first corn ripened, was one of the most important religious observances, marking the beginning of a new year and a time of renewal and forgiveness. Beyond the Three Sisters, the Cherokee cultivated sunflowers, tobacco, and various other crops, while also gathering a wide variety of wild plants for food, medicine, and other uses. Their knowledge of the natural world was encyclopedic, accumulated over countless generations of careful observation and experimentation. They knew which plants could heal specific ailments, which could be eaten safely, which provided materials for baskets or dyes, and which held spiritual power. Hunting was also central to Cherokee life, though it was governed by elaborate protocols and spiritual practices. Deer were the most important game animal, providing meat, hides for clothing and blankets, bones for tools, and sinew for cordage. The Cherokee were skilled hunters who used bows, blowguns, and various traps to take game, always approaching the hunt with respect for the animals and awareness of the spiritual dimensions of taking life. Hunters performed purification rituals before hunting and showed respect to the spirits of the animals they killed, understanding that all life was interconnected and that humans had responsibilities as well as rights within the natural world. Cherokee society was organized around matrilineal clans, meaning that identity, inheritance, and kinship were traced through the mother's line. There were 7 original clans: the Bird Clan, Blue Clan, Deer Clan, Long Hair Clan, Paint Clan, Wild Potato Clan, and Wolf Clan. Each clan had specific responsibilities and roles within Cherokee society, and clan membership determined many aspects of an individual's life, including whom they could marry. Marriage within one's own clan was strictly forbidden and considered a serious taboo. The clan system provided a sophisticated framework for organizing society, preventing inbreeding, establishing clear patterns of reciprocal obligation and support, and creating bonds that connected people across different towns. If a Cherokee person traveled to a distant town, they could seek hospitality from members of their own clan, who were obligated to provide food and shelter. The clans also played crucial roles in maintaining justice and social order, as they were responsible for handling disputes and exacting compensation or revenge for wrongs done to their members. Cherokee political structure was remarkably democratic and sophisticated, featuring separate leadership for times of peace and times of war. The peace chief, often called the White Chief, was responsible for civil governance, dispute resolution, and managing the town's affairs during peaceful times. The war chief, or Red Chief, took leadership during times of conflict. Decisions affecting the entire town were made in council, where men and women both had voices, though in different capacities. Women had significant political power, particularly the beloved women, elder females who had earned special respect and authority through their wisdom and service to the community. The concept of consensus was fundamental to Cherokee political culture. Councils would deliberate at length, listening to all voices, seeking to find solutions that all could accept. This was not a system of majority rule, but rather a patient process of working toward agreement. When decisions could not be reached by consensus, those who disagreed were generally free to follow their own course, as Cherokee society placed high value on individual autonomy within the framework of communal responsibility. Cherokee towns were centers of social, political, and ceremonial life, but the Cherokee world extended far beyond individual settlements. A complex network of trails connected Cherokee towns to one another and to the territories of neighboring peoples. These trails served as trade routes, communication lines, and pathways for warriors and diplomats. The Cherokee traded extensively with other indigenous nations, exchanging goods, ideas, and sometimes forming political and military alliances. The spiritual life of the Cherokee was rich and complex, pervaded by an understanding that the world was filled with spiritual power and populated by supernatural beings. The Cherokee recognized a great creator deity, often referred to as the Great Spirit or the Creator, but their religious practice also acknowledged numerous other spiritual beings, including the spirits of animals, plants, rivers, and mountains. Everything in the natural world was understood to possess spiritual essence, and humans were expected to maintain proper relationships with these spiritual forces through prayer, ceremony, and respectful behavior. Cherokee ceremonies marked the turning of the seasons, celebrated harvests, prepared warriors for battle, healed the sick, and maintained the cosmic balance. These ceremonies were often elaborate affairs involving dance, song, prayer, fasting, and the use of sacred plants and objects. Religious knowledge was the province of specialized priests and practitioners who underwent long apprenticeships to learn the prayers, formulas, and procedures necessary to communicate effectively with the spiritual world. The Cherokee understanding of health and illness was similarly sophisticated and spiritually grounded. Disease was believed to result from spiritual disharmony, violation of taboos, witchcraft, or the revenge of animal spirits offended by improper hunting practices. Healing, therefore, required not just physical remedies but spiritual ones as well: prayers, purification rituals, and the restoration of proper relationships between the patient and the spiritual world. Cherokee medicine combined extensive knowledge of herbal remedies with spiritual healing practices, and their doctors were highly skilled practitioners whose services were sought by other tribes, and eventually by European colonists as well. Art and craftsmanship flourished in Cherokee society. Cherokee women were renowned for their basketry, creating beautiful and functional baskets using river cane and other natural materials, often decorated with intricate dyed patterns. Cherokee potters produced both utilitarian vessels for cooking and storage and ceremonial objects of great beauty. Beadwork, carving, and other crafts were practiced with skill and creativity, producing objects that were both practical and aesthetically pleasing. This, then, was the Cherokee world on the eve of European contact, a sophisticated society with deep roots in its homeland, complex political and social structures, rich spiritual traditions, extensive knowledge of the natural world, and a strong sense of identity as a people. The Cherokee were not primitive savages living in a state of nature, as European colonizers would often characterize indigenous peoples, but rather members of a highly developed civilization with its own systems of law, governance, spirituality, education, and culture. The Cherokee had faced challenges before, conflicts with neighboring tribes, periods of drought or hardship, internal disputes, and had endured and adapted. But nothing in their long history would prepare them for what was about to come. The arrival of strangers from across the great ocean, bringing new technologies, new diseases, new ideas, and ultimately an existential threat to the Cherokee way of life. First contact and the colonial period. The first encounters between the Cherokee and Europeans were fleeting and inconsequential. Spanish explorers pushing north from their colonies in Florida and the Caribbean may have encountered Cherokee people as early as the 1540s, during Hernando de Soto's expedition through the southeast. These early contacts were brief and violent, characterized by mutual incomprehension and often by Spanish brutality. The Spanish were seeking gold and glory, not understanding or accommodation, and the indigenous peoples they encountered were often treated with extreme cruelty. These early Spanish expeditions brought more than violence, however. They also brought diseases, smallpox, measles, influenza, and other Old World pathogens to which the indigenous peoples of the Americas had no immunity. These diseases spread far beyond the paths of the conquistadors themselves, carried by trade networks and traveling from community to community with devastating effect. Scholars estimate that epidemic diseases may have reduced indigenous populations in the southeast by 50 to 90% between the mid-16th century and the early 18th century, a demographic catastrophe of almost unimaginable proportions. The Cherokee, protected somewhat by their mountainous homeland and relative distance from the early centers of European colonization, may have suffered less severely than some coastal peoples, but they did not escape unscathed. Oral traditions and early historical accounts suggest that the Cherokee population was significantly reduced by disease epidemics before sustained European contact began. Entire towns may have been depopulated, social structures disrupted, and valuable knowledge lost as elders died before they could pass on their wisdom to the next generation. It was not until the late 17th century that sustained contact between the Cherokee and European colonists began in earnest. English colonists had established settlements in Virginia and the Carolinas, and they were hungry for land, trade, and influence. The Cherokee, for their part, were interested in the trade goods the Europeans offered: metal tools, cloth, guns, and other manufactured items that could make life easier or provide advantages in conflicts with rival tribes. The deerskin trade became the primary economic relationship between the Cherokee and English colonists in the late 1600s and early 1700s. Cherokee hunters, using guns acquired through trade, dramatically increased their take of deer, processing the hides and trading them to colonial merchants in exchange for European goods. This trade had profound effects on Cherokee society. The acquisition of guns made hunting easier, but also intensified warfare with neighboring tribes who competed for hunting territories and trade advantages. Metal tools replaced stone implements, and cloth began to supplement or replace traditional clothing made from animal hides and plant fibers. The trade also created dependencies. As the Cherokee became accustomed to European goods, they found themselves increasingly dependent on continued trade to maintain their standard of living. This dependency gave colonial traders and governments leverage over Cherokee communities, allowing them to influence Cherokee politics and policy. The trader became an important figure in Cherokee towns, often marrying into the community and serving as an intermediary between Cherokee and colonial societies. Many of these traders were rough men living on the frontier, interested primarily in profit and not above cheating their Cherokee trading partners or creating conflict to serve their own interests. But there were also traders who formed genuine bonds with Cherokee communities, who respected Cherokee culture, and who used their positions to advocate for Cherokee interests in dealings with colonial governments. The children of these traders, born of Cherokee mothers and European fathers, would play increasingly important roles in Cherokee history as cultural mediators who understood both worlds. The early 18th century was a time of intense geopolitical competition in the Southeast. The British in the Carolinas and Virginia, the French moving down from Canada and up from Louisiana, and the Spanish in Florida all sought to control territory and trade in the region. The Cherokee, along with other indigenous nations like the Creek, Chickasaw, Choctaw, and Catawba, found themselves courted and pressured by these European powers, each seeking indigenous allies against their European rivals. The Cherokee leadership understood that they were in a precarious position, caught between competing imperial powers, each of which could potentially threaten Cherokee independence. Cherokee diplomacy in this period showed remarkable sophistication as Cherokee leaders worked to play European powers against each other, seeking to maintain Cherokee autonomy while acquiring the trade goods and support they needed. Cherokee delegations traveled to Charleston, Williamsburg, and even across the Atlantic to London, negotiating treaties and trading agreements. In 1730, a delegation of 7 Cherokee leaders traveled to London to meet with King George II. This delegation was led by Moytoy, who had been recognized by the British as the Emperor of the Cherokee. A title that didn't quite correspond to Cherokee political reality, but served British interests in having a single leader with whom to negotiate. The Cherokee delegates were received with great ceremony in London, where they drew crowds of curious onlookers. They agreed to a treaty of alliance with Britain and exclusive trading rights, though the full implications of what they had agreed to may not have been entirely clear to them. The Cherokee-British alliance would be tested and strained repeatedly over the following decades. In the 1750s and early 1760s, the Cherokee found themselves drawn into the conflict known in North America as the French and Indian War, part of the larger 7 Years' War between Britain and France. The Cherokee initially allied with the British against the French and their indigenous allies, but this alliance deteriorated rapidly due to abuses by British soldiers and settlers. Cherokee warriors serving alongside British colonial forces were often treated with contempt and cheated of promised payments and supplies. Meanwhile, settlers on the frontier were encroaching on Cherokee lands, ignoring boundaries established by treaties. Tensions exploded into the Anglo-Cherokee War of 1758-1761, a brutal conflict that saw atrocities committed by both sides. British forces under Colonel James Grant invaded Cherokee territory in 1761, systematically destroying Cherokee towns and crops in a scorched earth campaign designed to break Cherokee resistance. The Cherokee, faced with starvation and the destruction of their homeland, sued for peace. The war ended with a treaty that forced the Cherokee to cede some territory, but left their core homeland intact. However, the war had been devastating. Many towns had been destroyed, crops burned, and people killed or displaced. The Cherokee had learned a bitter lesson about the nature of their relationship with the British colonists. They were not truly allies or equals, but rather subordinates, expected to serve British interests and make way for British expansion. The American Revolution, which broke out in 1775, presented the Cherokee with another agonizing choice. Most Cherokee leaders recognized that the American colonists represented a greater threat to Cherokee lands than did the distant British Crown, which had at least attempted, however half-heartedly, to limit settler expansion. The Royal Proclamation of 1763 had established a boundary line beyond which colonists were not supposed to settle, though this boundary was largely ignored by frontier settlers. The American revolutionaries, by contrast, were largely frontiersmen who actively wanted access to Western lands. The Cherokee, led by leaders like Dragging Canoe, largely sided with the British during the Revolutionary War. Dragging Canoe was a powerful war chief who recognized that American independence would spell disaster for the Cherokee. He famously warned other Cherokee leaders that if they made concessions of land to the colonists, they would be giving away lands that would be dark and bloody ground, proving prophetic about the conflicts that would follow. Cherokee warriors launched raids against American frontier settlements, seeking to stem the tide of expansion and support the British cause. The Americans retaliated with devastating effect. Expeditions were sent into Cherokee country to destroy towns and crops, following the same brutal tactics that had been employed during the earlier Anglo-Cherokee War. Cherokee towns were burned, food stores destroyed, and civilians killed or driven into the wilderness to face winter without shelter or supplies. By the war's end, the Cherokee were in a desperate position. The British had lost, and the Americans had won their independence. The Cherokee now found themselves at the mercy of the victorious Americans, who had no reason to feel grateful or merciful toward those who had fought against them. Moreover, the new American states and the weak federal government were both desperate for land to satisfy the demands of revolutionary veterans and to generate revenue through land sales. In the decades following the Revolution, the Cherokee were forced to sign treaty after treaty, each one ceding more land to the Americans. These treaties were often negotiated under duress, with Cherokee leaders facing threats of military action if they did not comply. Moreover, the treaties were frequently negotiated with unauthorized individuals or minority factions within Cherokee society, yet the Americans treated them as binding on the entire Cherokee nation. The pattern was relentless and devastating. Treaties would establish boundaries. American settlers would cross those boundaries illegally. The American government would do little or nothing to stop them. And eventually a new treaty would be negotiated to recognize the illegal settlements and establish new boundaries further west. The Cherokee were losing their homeland piece by piece, and there seemed to be no way to stop it. In response to this existential crisis, Cherokee society began to transform in dramatic ways. Some Cherokee, recognizing the overwhelming power of the Americans and the futility of military resistance, began to advocate for a different strategy: accommodation and adaptation. If the Cherokee could adopt the ways of American civilization, if they could demonstrate that they were civilized rather than savage, perhaps they could earn respect and protection for their remaining lands. This became the strategy of accommodation, and it would reshape Cherokee society over the next several decades. The path of civilization. The turn toward accommodation and civilization in Cherokee society was not a simple or uniform process, nor was it purely a reaction to American pressure. Cherokee society had always been dynamic and adaptive, incorporating new technologies and ideas when they proved useful. The dramatic transformation of Cherokee society in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, built on this existing flexibility, while being catalyzed by the existential threat posed by American expansion. The federal government under President George Washington and his successors actively promoted the civilization program among indigenous peoples, including the Cherokee. This program, ostensibly benevolent in its conception, aimed to transform indigenous peoples into farmers living on individual plots of land, practicing Christianity, speaking English, and adopting American-style political and social structures. The underlying assumption was that indigenous cultures were inferior and that indigenous peoples needed to abandon their traditional ways to survive in the modern world. For the Cherokee, embracing civilization was a strategy for survival. If they could prove that they were civilized, that they used their land productively according to American standards, that they had a stable government and legal system, perhaps the Americans would leave them in peace on their remaining lands. Many Cherokee leaders threw themselves into this transformation with remarkable energy and success. The Cherokee began to adopt American-style agriculture, moving away from communal farming toward individual family farms. Cherokee men, who had traditionally focused on hunting and warfare while women did most of the farming, now took up the plow. Some Cherokee, particularly those of mixed Cherokee and European ancestry, established substantial plantations modeled on those of wealthy white Southerners, complete with enslaved African Americans working the fields. The adoption of slavery by some Cherokee was one of the darker aspects of their transformation. While Cherokee society had traditionally practiced a form of slavery through the capture of enemies in warfare, this was quite different from the chattel slavery of the American South. As the Cherokee sought to demonstrate their civilization and some Cherokee individuals pursued wealth through plantation agriculture, some adopted the institution of slavery with all its horrors. By the 1820s, several hundred enslaved people were held by Cherokee owners, though the majority of Cherokee did not own slaves and continued to practice subsistence farming. Education became a major focus of the civilization program. Missionaries invited into Cherokee territory established schools where Cherokee children could learn to read and write in English, study mathematics and geography, and receive instruction in Christianity. The Moravians were among the first, establishing a mission at Spring Place in 1801. They were followed by other Protestant denominations, each establishing missions and schools throughout Cherokee territory. Many Cherokee embraced Christianity, finding in it spiritual truths that resonated with their own beliefs, or pragmatically recognizing that conversion was expected by the Americans whose goodwill they needed. Cherokee Christianity often took distinctive forms, however, blending Christian theology with traditional Cherokee spiritual concepts and practices. Some Cherokee became devout Christians who rejected traditional practices entirely, while others maintained traditional beliefs alongside their Christian faith, and still others resisted conversion altogether. The transformation of Cherokee society created tensions and divisions. Those Cherokee who most completely embraced civilization, who spoke English, owned slaves, practiced Christianity, and dressed in American-style clothing, came to be called the mixed bloods, or progressives, though these terms were imprecise and contested. These individuals, often but not always of mixed Cherokee and European ancestry, came to dominate Cherokee politics and economics in the early 19th century. Other Cherokee, called full bloods or traditionals, were more skeptical of the civilization program. They maintained traditional practices, spoke Cherokee rather than English, and lived in more traditional ways. These terms were problematic and didn't capture the full complexity of Cherokee society. Many full bloods adopted some aspects of American civilization, and many mixed bloods maintained deep connections to Cherokee culture and identity. But the division between those who embraced transformation and those who resisted it was real and would have profound consequences for Cherokee history. Despite these internal tensions, the Cherokee made remarkable progress in adopting the outward forms of American civilization. By the 1820s, Cherokee territory was dotted with farms and plantations, churches and schools, mills and stores. The Cherokee had developed a substantial economy based on agriculture and trade, with many Cherokee families achieving prosperity and stability. The most dramatic symbol of Cherokee civilization came in 1821, when a Cherokee man named Sequoyah completed a syllabary for writing the Cherokee language. Sequoyah was a remarkable individual, a silversmith and trader who had never learned to read or write in English, but who recognized the power of written language and became determined to create a writing system for Cherokee. Over the course of 12 years, working largely in isolation and facing skepticism from many who thought his project was foolish or impossible, Sequoyah developed a syllabary consisting of 86 symbols, each representing a different syllable in the Cherokee language. The genius of Sequoyah's syllabary was its simplicity and logic. Unlike alphabets where letters must be combined to form syllables and words, Sequoyah's system had a unique symbol for each syllable. This made it relatively easy to learn. Many Cherokee became literate in their own language within a matter of days or weeks. The syllabary spread rapidly through Cherokee society with extraordinary speed. Within a few years, the Cherokee had one of the highest literacy rates of any people in North America, with the majority of Cherokee able to read and write in their own language. The impact of the syllabary cannot be overstated. It allowed the Cherokee to preserve and disseminate their own knowledge and stories in written form. It enabled correspondence and record-keeping. It provided a way to maintain Cherokee language and culture in the face of intense pressure to adopt English and American ways. Most importantly, perhaps, it demonstrated beyond any doubt that the Cherokee were fully capable of intellectual achievement equal to any people on Earth. In 1828, the Cherokee Nation began publishing a newspaper called the Cherokee Phoenix, printed in both Cherokee and English, using Sequoyah's syllabary alongside the English alphabet. The Phoenix was edited by Elias Boudinot, a well-educated Cherokee man who had attended mission schools and traveled extensively in the United States promoting Cherokee interests. The newspaper reported on Cherokee affairs, published editorials on issues affecting the Cherokee, reprinted articles from American newspapers, and served as a powerful voice for Cherokee sovereignty and rights. The Cherokee Phoenix was not just a newspaper but a statement and a weapon. It demonstrated Cherokee civilization to any who might doubt it. It provided a way for the Cherokee to communicate directly with the American public, bypassing hostile state governments and reaching sympathetic audiences in the northern states. And it served as a powerful tool for Cherokee nationalism, helping to forge a sense of shared identity and common purpose among the Cherokee people. The political transformation of Cherokee society kept pace with these economic and cultural changes. In 1827, the Cherokee Nation adopted a written constitution, modeled on the United States Constitution, establishing a formal government structure with executive, legislative, and judicial branches. The principal chief, elected to serve a 4-year term, headed the executive branch. A bicameral legislature called the National Council consisted of the National Committee, an upper house, and the Council, a lower house. The judicial system included district and circuit courts culminating in a Supreme Court. This constitution was a bold assertion of Cherokee sovereignty. It declared the Cherokee Nation to be a sovereign nation with jurisdiction over its territory and citizens. It established a formal legal code to replace traditional clan-based justice with a centralized system of laws and courts. It was designed to prove to the Americans that the Cherokee had a legitimate government worthy of respect and recognition. John Ross emerged as the dominant political leader of the Cherokee Nation during this period. Ross was of mixed Scottish and Cherokee ancestry, fluent in both English and Cherokee, and deeply committed to Cherokee independence and survival. He would serve as principal chief for nearly 40 years, from 1828 to 1866, guiding the Cherokee through their darkest hours with dignity, determination, and political skill. Under Ross's leadership, and with the support of a cadre of talented Cherokee leaders and intellectuals, the Cherokee Nation presented to the world a picture of a civilized, progressive, Christian nation. They had done everything the Americans had asked of them. They had given up war, adopted agriculture, embraced Christianity, established schools, created a written language, published a newspaper, and organized a constitutional government. By any measure of civilization recognized in the early 19th century, the Cherokee were civilized. And yet, all of this would not be enough. The fundamental problem facing the Cherokee was not that they were perceived as uncivilized, but that they possessed land that white Americans wanted. No amount of civilization could overcome that simple, brutal fact. The state of Georgia, in whose boundaries much of the Cherokee homeland fell after the American Revolution, had been promised by the federal government that the United States would eventually extinguish Indian title to lands within the state. Georgia was growing impatient for the fulfillment of that promise. The election of Andrew Jackson as President of the United States in 1828 sealed the Cherokee's fate. Jackson was a Westerner, a former Indian fighter, and a firm believer that indigenous peoples should be removed from lands east of the Mississippi River. Under his administration, the policy of removal would be pursued with ruthless determination, and the Cherokee, despite all their efforts at civilization and accommodation, would face the greatest catastrophe in their history. The Trail of Tears. The crisis that would lead to the Trail of Tears began in 1829, shortly after Andrew Jackson's inauguration as president. The state of Georgia, emboldened by Jackson's known hostility toward indigenous peoples and his support for removal, passed a series of laws extending Georgia state jurisdiction over Cherokee territory and nullifying Cherokee law within the state's boundaries. These laws declared that the Cherokee Nation had no legal standing, that Cherokee courts had no authority, and that Cherokee territory was subject to Georgia law. The Georgia laws were designed to make life impossible for the Cherokee and to force them to leave. Cherokee people were forbidden from testifying in court against white people, meaning that white criminals could victimize Cherokee people with impunity. Cherokee gold mines. Gold had been discovered in Cherokee territory in 1828, intensifying white desire for Cherokee lands, were confiscated by the state. Cherokee lands were surveyed and divided into lots to be distributed to white Georgians through a land lottery. Cherokee people could be arrested for holding council meetings or for speaking out against removal. The Cherokee Nation, under John Ross's leadership, responded not with violence, but with legal and political resistance. They hired prominent lawyers and filed suit in federal court, arguing that Georgia's laws were unconstitutional and violated federal treaties with the Cherokee. These cases would eventually reach the Supreme Court, resulting in two landmark decisions that recognized Cherokee rights but ultimately proved powerless to protect them. The first case, Cherokee Nation v. Georgia, 1831, was decided against the Cherokee on technical grounds. Chief Justice John Marshall ruled that the Cherokee Nation could not bring suit in federal court as a foreign nation because indigenous nations were not foreign nations, but rather domestic dependent nations with a relationship to the federal government resembling that of a ward to his guardian. This decision, while denying the Cherokee immediate relief, actually affirmed the special status of indigenous nations and the federal government's responsibility toward them. The second case, Worcester versus Georgia, 1832, was a clear victory for the Cherokee. Samuel Worcester, a missionary living in Cherokee territory, had been arrested by Georgia for refusing to obtain a license from the state and swear an oath of allegiance to Georgia. The Supreme Court ruled that Georgia's laws were unconstitutional, that the Cherokee Nation was a distinct political community over which Georgia had no jurisdiction, and that federal law and treaties were supreme. Worcester and another imprisoned missionary were ordered released. Georgia refused to comply with the Supreme Court's decision. President Jackson, who should have enforced the court's ruling, reportedly said, "John Marshall has made his decision. Now let him enforce it," though this famous quote may be apocryphal. Whether or not Jackson said exactly these words, his administration did nothing to force Georgia's compliance. The Supreme Court had affirmed Cherokee rights, but without executive branch enforcement, the decision was merely words on paper. While these legal battles were being fought, Congress was debating the Indian Removal Act, legislation that would authorize the president to negotiate removal treaties with indigenous nations east of the Mississippi River. The debates over this act were fierce and passionate, with opponents arguing that removal would be a moral catastrophe and a violation of American principles, while supporters claimed it was necessary for American expansion and beneficial to indigenous peoples who could never peacefully coexist with white civilization. The Indian Removal Act passed in 1830 by a narrow margin. It did not mandate removal, it merely authorized the president to negotiate voluntary removal treaties and appropriated funds to implement such treaties. In practice, however, the act provided legal cover for a policy of coerced removal that would affect tens of thousands of indigenous people across the Southeast. The Cherokee Nation, under Ross's leadership, refused to negotiate a removal treaty. They had legal right on their side, moral right on their side, and the support of many Americans, particularly in the northern states where opposition to removal was strong. They believed that if they stood firm, if they continued to demonstrate their civilization and to appeal to American principles of justice, they would eventually prevail. But a faction of Cherokee leaders, led by Major Ridge, his son John Ridge, and his nephew Elias Boudinot, editor of the Cherokee Phoenix, came to a different conclusion. These men were not traitors or sellouts, though they would be denounced as such. They were patriots who believed that removal was inevitable, and that the Cherokees' only hope for survival was to negotiate the best possible terms while they still had some bargaining power. Better to leave voluntarily, they argued, with compensation for their lands and support for resettlement, than to be forcibly driven out with nothing. This group became known as the Treaty Party, while Ross and his supporters were called the National Party, or Ross Party. The division between these factions became increasingly bitter and personal, poisoning Cherokee politics and creating divisions that would persist for generations. In December 1835, the Treaty Party signed the Treaty of New Echota, agreeing to exchange all Cherokee lands east of the Mississippi for territory in the west, in what is now Oklahoma, plus compensation of $5 million. The treaty was negotiated without the authorization of the elected Cherokee government and was signed by a small minority of Cherokee people, perhaps 100 individuals out of a population of roughly 16,000. John Ross and the vast majority of Cherokee repudiated the treaty immediately, submitting petitions with thousands of Cherokee signatures protesting the treaty and affirming their desire to remain in their homeland. Despite these protests, the U.S. Senate ratified the Treaty of New Echota by a single vote in 1836. The treaty gave the Cherokee 2 years to voluntarily remove to the west. If they had not left by May 1838, they would be forcibly removed by the U.S. Army. John Ross continued to fight the treaty through every legal and political channel available, traveling to Washington to lobby Congress and the president, organizing petition campaigns and seeking support from sympathetic Americans. But time was running out. The 2-year deadline approached, and the vast majority of Cherokee remained in their homeland, hoping against hope that justice would prevail. In May 1838, General Winfield Scott arrived in Cherokee Territory with an army of 7,000 soldiers. Scott issued a proclamation to the Cherokee, urging them to cooperate with removal and warning that resistance would be futile. Then the soldiers began their work. Cherokee families were rounded up at bayonet point, often given no time to gather possessions or even to say goodbye to homes they had lived in for generations. They were marched to stockades, hastily built prisons where they would be held until removal could be organized. The roundup was carried out with brutal efficiency. Soldiers burst into homes during meals, forcing families to leave food on the table. Fields ready for harvest were abandoned. Livestock and possessions were left behind, soon to be looted by white Georgians who followed in the army's wake. The conditions in the stockades were horrific. Hundreds of people were crowded into inadequate facilities with insufficient food, water, and sanitation. Disease spread rapidly: measles, whooping cough, dysentery. Children and elderly people began to die. The Cherokee, a proud people who had maintained their dignity through years of crisis, were reduced to prisoners in their own homeland, helpless and humiliated. The removal itself began in the summer of 1838 and continued through the winter. The Cherokee were divided into groups of about 1,000 people each and sent west along different routes, some by river, some overland. The river route proved disastrous, with steamboats overcrowded and disease-ridden. John Ross, who had remained with his people and now worked to make the best of an unbearable situation, negotiated with the federal government to allow the Cherokee to manage their own removal, hoping to minimize suffering. The overland removals, organized into 13 groups under Cherokee leadership, departed in the fall and winter of 1838-39. The routes taken by these groups would become known collectively as the Trail of Tears, though the Cherokee called it Nunahi Duna Tlo Hilu I, the trail where they cried. The journey was approximately 1,000 miles, depending on the route taken, through wilderness and settled country, across rivers and mountains, in the worst weather imaginable. The winter of 1838-39 was particularly brutal, with heavy snows and freezing temperatures. The Cherokee, many of them inadequately clothed and shod, struggled through ice and snow. Food was often insufficient. Horses and wagons broke down or became stuck in mud. The sick and elderly, unable to keep up, were left behind to die. Disease stalked the removal routes. Whooping cough, measles, pneumonia, and other illnesses killed people by the hundreds. Pregnant women gave birth on the trail, and many babies died shortly after birth. Elderly people, unable to withstand the hardships, simply lay down and died. Children became separated from their parents in the chaos and confusion. The emotional toll was as devastating as the physical suffering. Cherokee people were being torn from their homeland, from the mountains and rivers and valleys where their ancestors were buried, from the places where their culture had developed over countless generations. They were losing not just their homes, but their connection to the land that defined them as a people. Many lost hope. Some committed suicide rather than continue. The sound of weeping was constant along the trail. Exact numbers of deaths are difficult to determine as records were incomplete and contradictory. Conservative estimates suggest that at least 4,000 Cherokee died as a result of removal, from the roundup, in the stockades, on the trail itself, and in the months immediately following arrival in the West. Some estimates are much higher. Out of a population of roughly 16,000, this represented a loss of 25 to 40% of the Cherokee Nation. Among the dead was Quati Ross, wife of Principal Chief John Ross. She gave her blanket to a sick child during the removal and subsequently died of pneumonia. Her death symbolized the sacrifice and suffering of the entire Cherokee people during this dark time. The removal was not complete. Several hundred Cherokee managed to evade the roundup by hiding in the mountains of North Carolina. These Cherokee, under the leadership of Tsali and Yonaguska, and with the help of white friends like William Holland Thomas, managed to remain in the East. They faced years of hardship and uncertainty, but they endured, and their descendants would eventually become the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians, maintaining a Cherokee presence in the ancestral homeland to this day. The Trail of Tears stands as one of the darkest chapters in American history, a shameful episode of ethnic cleansing motivated by greed and racism, carried out in violation of treaties and Supreme Court decisions, resulting in thousands of deaths and immeasurable suffering. For the Cherokee, it was a catastrophe that threatened their very existence as a people. Everything they had built, their farms and plantations, their churches and schools, their newspaper and government, had to be abandoned or destroyed. Their civilization, created at such great cost and with such high hopes, had not saved them. Yet even in this darkest hour, the Cherokee demonstrated remarkable resilience. They had survived, diminished and traumatized, but not destroyed. In the West, they would have to rebuild everything from scratch, creating a new home in an unfamiliar land. But they would do so, and in doing so, they would prove that the Cherokee Nation could not be eliminated, that Cherokee identity was not tied merely to a place, but carried in the hearts and minds of the people themselves. Rebuilding in the West. The Cherokee who survived the Trail of Tears arrived in Indian Territory, the land west of the Mississippi that would eventually become Oklahoma, between 1838 and 1839, joining the Old Settlers, Cherokee who had voluntarily moved west in the 1820s and early 1830s, and the Treaty Party members who had removed earlier under the terms of the Treaty of New Echota. What should have been a reunion of the Cherokee people became instead a period of civil conflict and bitter division. The wounds of removal were fresh and deep. The National Party, loyal to John Ross, blamed the Treaty Party for the disaster that had befallen the Cherokee. The fact that Major Ridge, John Ridge, and Elias Boudinot had signed the Treaty of New Echota, effectively selling Cherokee lands without authorization, was seen as treason under Cherokee law, which prescribed death for those who sold Cherokee land without proper authority. On June 22, 1839, the violence came. In coordinated attacks, members of the Ridge family and Elias Boudinot were assassinated by Cherokee men loyal to the National Party. Major Ridge was shot while riding along a road. John Ridge was dragged from his bed in front of his wife and children and stabbed to death. Elias Boudinot was killed with a tomahawk while helping missionaries with construction work. These killings, carried out as executions under traditional Cherokee law, traumatized the Cherokee Nation and sparked years of factional violence. The assassinations and the reprisals that followed them created a state of civil war within the Cherokee Nation. Treaty Party supporters, who saw the killings as murder rather than legitimate execution, formed armed bands and sought revenge. John Ross, who likely had not directly ordered the killings but who represented the faction that had carried them out, faced accusations of being behind the assassinations. The violence continued sporadically throughout the 1840s, with ambushes, raids, and murders creating an atmosphere of fear and instability. Stand Watie, a Treaty Party leader and the brother of Elias Boudinot, became a central figure in the resistance to the Ross government. Wati narrowly escaped assassination on the same day his brother was killed, having been warned at the last moment. He would spend the rest of his life as a political and military opponent of John Ross, leading the Treaty Party faction and eventually becoming a Confederate general during the Civil War. Despite this internal conflict, the Cherokee began the difficult work of rebuilding their nation. The first priority was basic survival. The Cherokee needed to establish homes, plant crops, and create the infrastructure necessary for daily life. The land they had been given in Indian Territory was different from their southeastern homeland, more prairie, hotter summers, more extreme weather. They had to adapt their farming practices and ways of living to this new environment. The federal government had promised support and resources as part of the removal treaties, but these promises were often unfulfilled or inadequately met. The Cherokee received some tools, seeds, and livestock, but not enough to compensate for what they had lost. Many Cherokee families struggled with poverty and hunger in the years immediately following removal, dependent on government annuities that were often late or diverted by corrupt officials. Nevertheless, the Cherokee showed remarkable resilience. Within a few years, Cherokee farms were producing crops again. Cherokee entrepreneurs established businesses. Cherokee congregations rebuilt their churches and resumed worship. The Cherokee government, despite the factional divisions, continued to function, with John Ross remaining as principal chief and the National Council continuing to meet and legislate. In 1839, the Cherokee Nation adopted a new constitution in Indian Territory, re-establishing their formal government structure and affirming Cherokee sovereignty in their new homeland. This constitution was similar to the 1827 Constitution, but included some modifications to address the new circumstances. The Cherokee governmental structure, with executive, legislative, and judicial branches, was maintained, and the capital was established at Tahlequah, which would remain the Cherokee capital to the present day. Education was a priority for the Cherokee government. Understanding that education was essential for the Cherokee to navigate the modern world and to preserve their culture, the Cherokee Nation invested heavily in schools. The Cherokee Male Seminary and Cherokee Female Seminary, established in the 1850s, provided advanced education comparable to the best schools in the United States. These institutions produced generations of Cherokee leaders, professionals, and intellectuals who would guide the Cherokee Nation through the challenges of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The Cherokee also re-established their printing press and began publishing newspapers again, continuing the tradition started with the Cherokee Phoenix. These publications served as vehicles for Cherokee political discourse, preserved and promoted Cherokee language and culture, and provided news and information to Cherokee citizens scattered across the territory. Cherokee cultural life also revived in Indian Territory. Traditional ceremonies and practices that had been suppressed or abandoned during the civilization period experienced a revival as Cherokee people sought to reconnect with their heritage. The Kituwa Society, a traditionalist religious and cultural organization, was formed in the 1850s to preserve Cherokee language, culture, and traditional ways. At the same time, Christian churches continued to grow and flourish, serving as important community institutions. The Cherokee economy in Indian Territory was diverse and relatively prosperous, at least for some. Large Cherokee landowners established substantial cattle ranches and farms. Cherokee merchants operated stores and trading posts. The Cherokee Nation derived revenue from grazing fees, timber sales, and other uses of the national domain. Intermarried whites and Cherokee of mixed ancestry often dominated the economic and political life of the nation. while many full-blood Cherokee lived more traditional lifestyles as subsistence farmers or maintained older cultural practices. This economic and cultural diversity reflected the fundamental divisions within Cherokee society, between progressive and traditional, between mixed blood and full blood, between those who embraced American-style capitalism and individual land ownership, and those who preferred communal landholding and traditional ways. These divisions, while they had existed in the Old Country, became more pronounced in Indian Territory and would shape Cherokee politics and society for generations. The 1850s were a period of relative stability and growth for the Cherokee Nation, but storm clouds were gathering. The United States was moving towards civil war over the issue of slavery, and the Cherokee Nation, located between Union states to the north and Confederate states to the south, would be unable to avoid being drawn into the conflict. The question of slavery divided the Cherokee Nation just as it divided the United States. Some Cherokee, particularly wealthy mixed-blood planters, owned slaves and had economic interests tied to the slave system. Others, including many traditional full-blood Cherokee, opposed slavery or were indifferent to it. The old factional divisions between Ross Party and Treaty Party, which had never fully healed, aligned roughly with divisions over slavery, with Treaty Party supporters more likely to be slave owners and Confederate sympathizers. When the Civil War began in 1861, Principal Chief John Ross attempted to keep the Cherokee Nation neutral. He understood that taking sides would be disastrous for the Cherokee, regardless of who won. But the Cherokee Nation's location made neutrality impossible. Confederate forces occupied Indian Territory early in the war, and Confederate agents, including Albert Pike, pressured Cherokee leaders to ally with the Confederacy. In October 1861, the Cherokee Nation signed a treaty with the Confederate States of America. John Ross, bowing to what he saw as military necessity and political reality, signed the treaty on behalf of the nation, though he did so reluctantly and with great misgivings. Stand Watie and the Treaty Party faction, by contrast, were enthusiastic Confederate allies, and Watie would become a Confederate general, leading Cherokee troops in numerous engagements throughout the war. The Civil War was another catastrophe for the Cherokee Nation. Cherokee Territory became a battleground, with Union and Confederate forces fighting for control. Cherokee people were divided, with some supporting the Union and others the Confederacy, and Cherokee fought Cherokee in numerous engagements. The war destroyed what had been rebuilt after removal. Farms were burned, livestock stolen, homes destroyed. Refugees fled in all directions, seeking safety wherever they could find it. John Ross, captured by Union forces in 1862, spent the rest of the war in exile in Washington, D.C., where he declared his loyalty to the Union and tried to minimize the consequences of the Cherokee alliance with the Confederacy. Stand Watie, meanwhile, became the last Confederate general to surrender, holding out until June 1865, weeks after Lee's surrender at Appomattox. The Cherokee Nation emerged from the Civil War devastated once again. Approximately one-third of the Cherokee population had died during the war years, from battle, disease, exposure, and starvation. The Cherokee economy was in ruins. Homes, farms, schools, churches, all had to be rebuilt again. And the Cherokee Nation faced punishment from the victorious United States government for their alliance with the Confederacy, despite the fact that thousands of Cherokee had fought for the Union and that the Confederate alliance had been forced upon them by circumstances. The treaty that ended the war and re-established relations between the Cherokee Nation and the United States, signed in 1866, imposed harsh terms. The Cherokee were forced to free their slaves and grant them citizenship in the Cherokee Nation. They had to cede the western portion of their territory, the Cherokee outlet for the settlement of other tribes. they had to allow railroads to be built through Cherokee territory. These concessions reduced Cherokee land holdings and Cherokee sovereignty, setting the stage for further losses in the years to come. Yet once again, the Cherokee rebuilt. Schools were reopened, farms re-established, businesses started. The Cherokee government continued to function, now under the leadership of principal chiefs who followed John Ross, who had died in 1866. The Cherokee Nation in the late 19th century was a functioning democratic state with its own government, laws, schools, and newspapers, a testament to the resilience and determination of the Cherokee people. But the greatest threat was yet to come, one that would once again fundamentally transform Cherokee society and threaten Cherokee sovereignty: the allotment policy, which aimed to break up tribal lands and terminate tribal governments, assimilating indigenous peoples into American society as individual citizens. Allotment and the fight for sovereignty. The late 19th century brought a new assault on Cherokee sovereignty and identity, one that came cloaked in the language of reform and humanitarian concern, but was motivated by the same old desire for indigenous lands that had driven removal. This was the era of allotment, when the United States government sought to break up tribally held lands, divide them into individual plots to be assigned to individual tribal members, and open the surplus lands to white settlement. The philosophy behind allotment was assimilationist. Reformers argued that communal landholding was primitive and prevented indigenous peoples from progressing towards civilization. If indigenous people could be given individual plots of land, if they could be transformed into private property owners and farmers living on their own homesteads, they would be assimilated into American society and tribal governments could be dissolved. This policy, supporters claimed, would be good for indigenous peoples, allowing them to join the American mainstream as equals. The reality, of course, was far different. Allotment was a disaster for indigenous nations across the United States, resulting in the loss of millions of acres of land and the impoverishment of indigenous communities. The Cherokee resisted allotment with all the political and legal resources they could muster, but ultimately they could not prevent it. The Dawes Act of 1887 authorized the allotment of tribal lands across the United States, but initially it did not apply to the Cherokee and other tribes in Indian Territory, who had been promised that their lands would be theirs as long as grass shall grow and rivers run. But pressure mounted to open Indian Territory to white settlement and to break up the tribal governments that controlled it. Railroads, which had been granted rights of way through Indian Territory, wanted the land opened for development. White settlers in neighboring states coveted the lands of Indian Territory. Corporations sought access to the mineral resources of the territory. Politicians saw votes and political advantage in opening Indian Territory to settlement. All of these groups lobbied Congress and the administration to extend allotment to Indian Territory. The Curtis Act of 1898 finally brought allotment to the Cherokee and the other tribes of Indian Territory. This act abolished tribal courts, provided for the surveying and allotment of tribal lands, and set in motion the process that would eventually lead to Oklahoma statehood and the dissolution of tribal governments in the territory. The Cherokee fought the Curtis Act in court and in Congress, but the forces arrayed against them were too strong. The Dawes Commission was established to oversee the allotment process, including the creation of tribal rolls listing every person entitled to receive an allotment. This enrollment process was complex and controversial. Who counted as Cherokee? How much Cherokee blood was required? What about people who had married into the tribe or had been adopted? The Dawes Commission's work on Cherokee enrollment resulted in the Dawes Rolls, completed in 1907, which listed all Cherokee people entitled to receive an allotment. These rolls would become the basis for Cherokee citizenship in the 20th century. But their creation was contentious. Some people who considered themselves Cherokee were excluded. Others who had minimal connection to Cherokee culture or community were included. The question of Cherokee identity, which had always been complex, became tied to a legal definition based on documentation and blood quantum. The allotment process divided Cherokee lands into individual plots, with each Cherokee citizen receiving an allotment based on their enrollment status. Parcels were typically 160 acres for adults and smaller plots for children. The idea was that these allotments would be held in trust by the federal government for a period of years to prevent their immediate sale to land speculators, after which the allottees would receive full title and could dispose of the land as they wished. In practice, allotment was an administrative and human disaster. The allotment process was slow and poorly managed. Many Cherokee received allotments of poor quality land unsuitable for farming. The trust period restrictions were regularly circumvented through legal and illegal means, with land speculators, grafters, and criminals defrauding Cherokee allottees of their lands. Unscrupulous individuals were appointed as guardians for Cherokee children who had received allotments, then sold the children's lands and pocketed the proceeds. The surplus lands, those remaining after all eligible Cherokee had received their allotments, were opened to white settlement. In a series of land runs and lotteries, thousands of white settlers flooded into what had been Indian territory, fundamentally changing the demographics and character of the region. Cherokee people who had been the majority in their own territory suddenly became a minority in their own homeland. In 1907, Indian Territory was merged with Oklahoma Territory to create the state of Oklahoma. The admission of Oklahoma as a state brought the formal dissolution of the Cherokee government. The principal chief's office was abolished. The National Council was dissolved. Cherokee courts no longer had jurisdiction. The Cherokee Nation, which had maintained its government through removal, civil war, and decades of pressure, officially ceased to exist as a functioning government. Or so it seemed. In fact, the Cherokee Nation did not simply disappear. While the formal governmental structures were dissolved, Cherokee identity and community persisted. The Cherokee people continued to see themselves as Cherokee, to speak the Cherokee language, to practice Cherokee traditions, and to maintain connections to one another. The Cherokee were not assimilated into American society, but remained a distinct people with their own identity and culture. The early 20th century was a dark time for the Cherokee. With their government dissolved, their lands divided and largely lost, their sovereignty stripped away, many Cherokee lived in poverty. Cherokee culture was under assault, with children forced to attend boarding schools where they were punished for speaking Cherokee and compelled to adopt white ways. The Cherokee language, which had been the primary language for most Cherokee just a generation earlier, was under threat as fewer children learned to speak it. Yet through all of this, Cherokee identity persisted. Families maintained traditions. Elders taught what they could to younger generations. Cherokee medicine and spirituality, driven underground by official suppression, survived in private practice. Cherokee communities, though no longer officially recognized as such, maintained their cohesion and distinctiveness. The Indian Reorganization Act of 1934, part of Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal, represented a shift in federal Indian policy away from forced assimilation towards support for tribal self-government. However, the tribes of Oklahoma, including the Cherokee, were initially excluded from the IRA. It wasn't until 1936 that a modified version of the Act, the Oklahoma Indian Welfare Act, extended some of its benefits to Oklahoma tribes. In the decades following allotment and Oklahoma statehood, The Cherokee Nation existed in a kind of legal limbo. The federal government continued to recognize the Cherokee Nation for some purposes. There was a principal chief appointed by the president to handle certain administrative matters, primarily related to allotment affairs. But there was no real tribal government, no sovereignty in any meaningful sense. This began to change in the 1960s and 1970s as the broader American Indian movement and the struggle for indigenous rights gained momentum. Cherokee people, like indigenous people across the United States, began to assert their rights and demand recognition of their sovereignty. They pointed to treaties that had never been abrogated, to the inherent rights of indigenous nations, and to the continuing existence of the Cherokee people as a distinct community. In 1970, Congress passed the Principal Chiefs Act, allowing the Cherokee Nation to elect its own principal chief for the first time since statehood. W. W. Keeler was elected and served until 1975. This was followed by the Cherokee Nation being able to elect its own government officials and to begin rebuilding governmental institutions. The real transformation came in 1976 when the Cherokee Nation ratified a new constitution, approved by vote of Cherokee citizens, establishing a modern governmental structure with executive, legislative, and judicial branches. This constitution, based on the 1839 Constitution but updated for contemporary circumstances, represented the formal rebirth of Cherokee self-government. Ross Swimmer was elected principal chief in 1975 and oversaw much of this governmental rebuilding. Under his leadership and that of his successors, the Cherokee Nation established modern administrative structures, developed economic enterprises to generate revenue, built health clinics, and community centers, and asserted Cherokee sovereignty in dealings with state and federal governments. The late 20th century saw the Cherokee Nation emerge as one of the most successful tribal nations in the United States. The tribe established businesses including manufacturing facilities, retail stores, and gaming operations. These enterprises generated revenue that could be used to fund governmental services, healthcare, education, and cultural preservation. The Cherokee Nation became a major employer in northeastern Oklahoma and an important economic and political force in the state. Gaming, authorized under the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act of 1988, proved particularly lucrative for the Cherokee Nation. Cherokee-owned casinos generated substantial revenue, allowing the tribe to expand services and become economically self-sufficient. While gaming was controversial, some Cherokee objected to it on cultural or moral grounds. It provided resources that allowed the Cherokee Nation to rebuild in ways that would have been impossible otherwise. The Cherokee Nation used its growing resources to address the needs of Cherokee people. The tribe established a comprehensive healthcare system, with clinics and hospitals providing care to Cherokee citizens. Cherokee Nation educational programs supported students from elementary school through college. Housing assistance helped Cherokee families obtain adequate homes. Elder care programs served aging Cherokee citizens. Language preservation initiatives worked to save the Cherokee language from extinction. Cultural preservation became a major priority. The Cherokee Nation invested in language programs, cultural events, museums, and heritage sites. The Cherokee Heritage Center in Tahlequah became a major institution preserving and presenting Cherokee culture and history. Traditional arts and crafts were supported and promoted. Ceremonies and practices that had nearly died out were revived. The Cherokee Nation also fought legal battles to protect Cherokee sovereignty and rights. Disputes with the state of Oklahoma over taxation, jurisdiction, and other issues led to court cases that clarified the extent of Cherokee sovereignty and the continuing legal status of Cherokee territory. In 2020, the Supreme Court's decision in McGirt v. Oklahoma affirmed that much of eastern Oklahoma remained Indian country for purposes of criminal jurisdiction, a major victory for tribal sovereignty that had profound implications for the Cherokee and other Oklahoma tribes. Throughout the late 20th and early 21st centuries, the Cherokee Nation navigated complex questions of identity and membership. Who counts as Cherokee? The debate over citizenship requirements continued, with some arguing for blood quantum requirements while others advocated for descent-based membership that didn't require a specific percentage of Cherokee blood. Controversies over the citizenship of descendants of Cherokee freedmen, formerly enslaved, people who had been granted Cherokee citizenship after the Civil War, led to legal battles and political divisions that echoed the old conflicts between progressives and traditionals. Despite these ongoing debates and challenges, the Cherokee Nation by the early 21st century had been dramatically transformed from the broken remnant of the allotment era. The tribe had population numbering in the hundreds of thousands. Though most Cherokee citizens lived outside the Cherokee Nation's jurisdictional area in Oklahoma, making it one of the largest indigenous nations in North America. The Cherokee Nation operated a sophisticated government with numerous departments and agencies, provided services to tens of thousands of people, employed thousands of workers, and was a major economic and political force in Oklahoma. The Cherokee today and the path forward. The Cherokee Nation in the 21st century is a complex modern entity that maintains connections to its ancient roots while navigating contemporary challenges. With a citizenship of over 400,000, the Cherokee Nation is one of the largest tribal nations in the United States, though the vast majority of Cherokee citizens live outside the Cherokee Nation's jurisdictional area in Oklahoma. Under the leadership of principal chiefs like Wilma Mankiller, who served from 1985 to 1995 as the first female principal chief of the Cherokee Nation, and her successors, the Cherokee Nation has continued to grow and develop. Mankiller was a transformative leader who focused on community development, cultural preservation, and self-reliance. Her emphasis on Cherokee people solving their own problems and taking control of their own destiny helped reshape Cherokee identity and governance. The current Cherokee Nation government operates out of its capital in Tahlequah, Oklahoma, the same location that has served as the Cherokee capital since 1839. The governmental complex includes modern office buildings, the Cherokee Nation Courthouse, and the historic Cherokee National Capitol Building, which has been restored and serves as a museum and symbol of Cherokee resilience and continuity. The Cherokee Nation's governmental structure mirrors that of the United States, with a separation of powers among executive, legislative, and judicial branches. The principal chief serves as the head of the executive branch, elected to 4-year terms. The tribal council functions as the legislature, with representatives elected from districts across the Cherokee Nation's jurisdictional area. The Cherokee Nation Supreme Court and lower courts form the judicial branch, interpreting Cherokee law and the Cherokee Constitution. The Cherokee Nation provides an extensive array of services to its citizens and to the broader community in northeastern Oklahoma. The Cherokee Nation Health Services operates clinics and hospitals, providing health care to Cherokee citizens and other indigenous people. These facilities offer comprehensive medical care, including specialized services like dialysis and behavioral health treatment that might otherwise be unavailable in rural Oklahoma. Education remains a high priority. The Cherokee Nation operates Head Start programs for young children, provides scholarships for college students, and runs career training programs for adults. The tribe has invested in Cherokee language education, recognizing that the Cherokee language is endangered and that its preservation is essential to maintaining Cherokee culture and identity. Cherokee language immersion schools teach children in Cherokee from an early age, while adult language classes help older Cherokee citizens learn or relearn the language. The Cherokee Heritage Center in Tahlequah serves as the primary cultural institution of the Cherokee Nation, housing museums, a replica ancient Cherokee village, and archives preserving Cherokee history and culture. The center offers educational programs, cultural events, and exhibitions that present Cherokee history and culture to both Cherokee citizens and the general public. Similar efforts occur at the Deligwa Cherokee Village, where traditional Cherokee life is demonstrated and preserved. The Cherokee Nation has also invested in economic development, creating businesses that generate revenue while providing employment for Cherokee citizens and others in northeastern Oklahoma. Cherokee Nation businesses operates casinos, hotels, retail outlets, and other enterprises. These businesses are significant employers in the region and generate revenue that funds governmental services. While the businesses operate to make profit, their ultimate purpose is to support the Cherokee Nation and its citizens. Cultural preservation extends beyond language to include traditional arts and crafts. Cherokee basket weaving, pottery, beadwork, and other traditional crafts are supported through educational programs and markets for traditional artwork. The Cherokee Nation helps traditional artists develop their skills and find markets for their work, ensuring that these important cultural practices continue. Cherokee spirituality and religious life encompasses both traditional practices and Christianity, which has been part of Cherokee life for nearly 2 centuries. Many Cherokee participate in both Christian worship and traditional ceremonies, seeing no contradiction between the two. The Kituwa Society continues to maintain traditional religious and cultural practices, while Cherokee Baptist, Methodist, and other Christian churches serve as important community institutions. The Cherokee Nation faces ongoing challenges in the 21st century. Language preservation remains critical. While there are still fluent Cherokee speakers, most are elderly, and the language is classified as endangered. The Cherokee Nation's language programs work against time to record the knowledge of elders and teach Cherokee to younger generations before the opportunity is lost. Identity and citizenship questions continue to generate debate and controversy. The question of who is Cherokee and what qualifications should be required for citizenship remains contested. The Cherokee Nation's citizenship requirements are based on descent from someone listed on the Dawes rolls, without a blood quantum requirement, but debates continue over whether this is the appropriate standard. The relationship with Cherokee freedmen descendants remains controversial. After the Civil War, the Cherokee Nation granted citizenship to formerly enslaved people who had been held by Cherokee owners. This citizenship was affirmed in the 1866 treaty with the United States. However, in the 20th century, freedmen descendants were removed from tribal rolls, and debates over their citizenship status led to legal battles that reached federal courts. In 2017, a federal court ruled in favor of the freedmen descendants' citizenship rights, reaffirming their status as Cherokee citizens. The Cherokee Nation also maintains relationships with other Cherokee groups. The Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians in North Carolina are descendants of those Cherokee who evaded removal and remained in the East. The United Kituwa Band of Cherokee Indians in Oklahoma, federally recognized as a separate tribe, represents traditional Cherokee who organize separately from the Cherokee Nation. These 3 federally recognized Cherokee tribes maintain their own governments while acknowledging their shared heritage and common identity as Cherokee people. Environmental challenges affect the Cherokee Nation as they do all communities. Issues like water quality, land use, and climate change have particular significance for indigenous peoples whose identities are deeply connected to their lands. The Cherokee Nation has taken active roles in environmental protection, managing natural resources on Cherokee lands, and advocating for environmental policies that protect the earth for future generations. Healthcare disparities affecting Indigenous peoples remain a challenge. While Cherokee Nation Health Services provides quality care, Cherokee citizens face higher rates of diabetes, heart disease, and other chronic conditions than the general population. Addressing these health disparities requires not just medical care, but also programs addressing the social determinants of health: poverty, education, nutrition, housing. The Cherokee Nation has increasingly asserted its sovereignty and rights in the political and legal arenas. The tribe has sued to protect Cherokee rights, negotiated government to government with federal and state authorities, and advocated for policies supporting tribal sovereignty and indigenous rights. The McGirt decision and subsequent cases have affirmed that significant portions of Oklahoma remain Indian country, with important implications for jurisdiction and sovereignty. Looking to the future, the Cherokee Nation faces the challenge of maintaining Cherokee identity and culture while adapting to changing circumstances. How can the Cherokee language be preserved when most Cherokee citizens don't speak it? How can traditional practices be maintained in a modern, urban society? How can Cherokee sovereignty be protected in the face of state and federal policies that may not respect tribal rights? How can the Cherokee Nation serve its citizens when most live far from Oklahoma? These challenges are significant, but the Cherokee have faced existential threats before and survived. The story of the Cherokee people is fundamentally one of resilience, adaptation, and survival. From the ancient past to the present, through colonization, removal, civil war, allotment, and cultural suppression, the Cherokee have endured. The survival of the Cherokee Nation is a testament to the strength of Cherokee identity and the determination of Cherokee people to remain Cherokee. Against all odds, through centuries of pressure to assimilate, abandon their culture, and disappear into American society, the Cherokee remain. The Cherokee language, though endangered, is still spoken. Cherokee traditions, though challenged, are still practiced. Cherokee identity, though contested and evolving, remains strong. The Cherokee Nation today represents the fulfillment of the promises made by ancestors who endured the Trail of Tears. That the Cherokee people would survive, that Cherokee culture would continue, that the Cherokee Nation would persist. Those who walked the Trail of Tears did so believing that even though they were being forced from their homeland, they would remain Cherokee, they would preserve their culture, and they would pass on their identity to future generations. Those promises have been kept. The Cherokee Nation exists. Cherokee culture lives. Cherokee people maintain their identity as Ani-Yunwia, the principal people. The journey from the ancient villages in the Misty Mountains to the modern government complex in Tahlequah has been long and often painful, marked by tragedy and loss, but it has also been marked by remarkable resilience, creativity, and determination. The Cherokee story is not over. New chapters are being written every day by Cherokee citizens who speak the language, practice traditions, participate in government, create art, raise families, and live their lives as Cherokee people. The challenges facing the Cherokee Nation in the 21st century are real and significant, but so too are the resources, determination, and cultural strength that the Cherokee bring to meeting those challenges. Conclusion: remembering and honoring the journey. As we come to the end of our journey through Cherokee history tonight, it is important to reflect on what this story means and what lessons it holds for us all. The Cherokee story is specific to one people, one nation, with its own unique culture, history, and experiences. Yet it also touches on universal human themes: the search for home, the struggle to maintain identity in the face of pressure to change, the capacity for resilience in the face of overwhelming adversity, and the power of community and culture to sustain people through the darkest times. The Cherokee people have endured catastrophes that would have destroyed less resilient nations. They have lost their homeland not once, but repeatedly, first through colonial conquest and encroachment, then through forced removal, and finally through allotment and the breaking up of their lands. They have faced diseases that killed large portions of their population. They have endured civil war, forced assimilation, cultural suppression, and governmental dissolution. They have been betrayed by treaties, ignored by courts, and targeted by policies designed to eliminate them as a distinct people. Yet the Cherokee survive. The Cherokee Nation exists today as a vibrant, functioning government serving hundreds of thousands of citizens. Cherokee culture, while changed and challenged, continues. The Cherokee language, while endangered, is still spoken and taught. Cherokee identity remains strong among people who proudly claim Cherokee heritage and work to preserve Cherokee traditions for future generations. How did the Cherokee survive? Part of the answer lies in their remarkable adaptability. The Cherokee have always been willing to adopt new technologies, new ideas, and new practices when doing so served Cherokee interests. From the adoption of European trade goods in the colonial period, to Sequoyah's creation of the syllabary, to the development of a written constitution, to modern economic enterprises, the Cherokee have shown a willingness to change and adapt. But the Cherokee have balanced adaptation with preservation. Even as they adopted new ways, they maintained core aspects of Cherokee identity and culture. The Cherokee language, traditional stories, spiritual practices, social structures, and sense of identity as a distinct people have persisted through all the changes and challenges. The Cherokee have shown that it is possible to adapt to new circumstances without losing one's identity, to change without being destroyed. Another key to Cherokee survival has been their political sophistication and determination. Cherokee leaders from the 18th century to the present have shown remarkable skill in navigating complex political situations, negotiating with more powerful adversaries, building alliances, using legal systems to protect Cherokee rights, and finding ways to preserve Cherokee sovereignty even when it seemed impossible. From the diplomatic missions to London in the colonial period, to the Supreme Court cases of the 1830s, to the rebuilding of Cherokee government in the 1970s, Cherokee leaders have fought for their people with intelligence, courage, and dedication. The Cherokee people themselves, the ordinary Cherokee citizens who raised families, farmed land, practiced traditions, spoke the language, and maintained their identity even when doing so was difficult or dangerous, are the real heroes of this story. It was their determination to remain Cherokee, to pass on their culture and language to their children, to maintain their communities and practices that ensured Cherokee survival. The Cherokee story also holds important lessons about injustice and its consequences. The Trail of Tears stands as one of the great injustices in American history, a shameful episode of ethnic cleansing that violated treaties, ignored court decisions, and resulted in thousands of deaths. It is important that this history be remembered, not to assign guilt to people living today, but to understand the past honestly and to recognize the ongoing effects of historical injustices. The trauma of removal, allotment, forced assimilation, and cultural suppression has had lasting effects on Cherokee communities and individuals. Historical trauma, the cumulative emotional and psychological wounding across generations, affects Indigenous peoples today, contributing to health disparities, social problems, and other challenges. Addressing these legacies requires not just acknowledging historical injustices, but also taking concrete steps to support indigenous communities and sovereignty. The Cherokee story also demonstrates the importance of sovereignty and self-determination for indigenous peoples. When indigenous nations have been able to govern themselves according to their own values and priorities, they have flourished. When their sovereignty has been stripped away or limited, they have struggled. The rebuilding of Cherokee government in the late 20th century and the Cherokee Nation's success in providing services, preserving culture, and advocating for its citizens shows what is possible when indigenous nations have genuine self-governance. For Cherokee people today, this history is not abstract or distant. It is the story of their ancestors, their families, their nation. Cherokee people carry this history with them, the pride in their ancestors' achievements, the pain of the injustices they endured, the determination to ensure that Cherokee culture and identity continue. Many Cherokee can trace their family histories through the major events we have discussed tonight, knowing that their own ancestors walked the Trail of Tears, survived the Civil War, endured allotment, or participated in the rebuilding of the Cherokee Nation. For non-Cherokee people, particularly Americans, this history is also not distant or abstract. It is part of American history, part of the story of the United States. The relationship between the United States and the Cherokee Nation, from the early treaties to the Trail of Tears to contemporary sovereignty issues, is part of the American story. Understanding this history is essential to understanding American history honestly and completely. The Cherokee story continues to unfold. New challenges emerge, new opportunities arise, and Cherokee people continue to navigate the complex task of maintaining their identity and culture while living in the modern world. Cherokee language programs work to teach the language to new generations. Cherokee artists create works that express Cherokee identity and experience. Cherokee scholars research and teach Cherokee history and culture. Cherokee citizens participate in their government, vote in elections, serve on councils and courts, and shape the future of the Cherokee Nation. The resilience shown by the Cherokee people over centuries provides inspiration not just for indigenous peoples facing their own challenges, but for anyone struggling to maintain identity and community in the face of pressure to conform or assimilate. The Cherokee story teaches that identity is not something fixed or static, but rather something that must be actively maintained and recreated by each generation. It shows that survival is possible even in the face of catastrophic loss, that cultures can persist even when threatened, and that determination and community can overcome seemingly insurmountable obstacles. As we conclude tonight, let us remember the Cherokee who came before, those who lived in the ancient villages, who resisted and accommodated colonization, who walked the Trail of Tears, who rebuilt in Indian territory, who endured allotment and assimilation, and who preserved Cherokee identity for future generations. Their struggles, their sacrifices, and their determination made possible the Cherokee Nation that exists today. Let us also recognize the Cherokee people of today who carry on the traditions, speak the language, participate in the government, practice the culture, and work to ensure that the Cherokee Nation will continue into the future. They honor their ancestors not just by remembering the past, but by living as Cherokee people in the present and preparing for the future. The story of the Cherokee is ultimately a story of hope. Despite everything, colonization, disease, removal, war, allotment, assimilation, the Cherokee endure. The Cherokee language is still spoken. Cherokee traditions are still practiced. The Cherokee Nation still exists. Cherokee people still identify as Cherokee. still maintain connections to their culture and history, still work to preserve their heritage for future generations. This survival, this persistence against all odds, is a testament to the strength of human community, the power of cultural identity, and the resilience of the human spirit. The Cherokee have shown that a people can survive catastrophe, that culture can persist in the face of determined efforts to eliminate it, and that identity can be maintained across generations despite overwhelming pressure to assimilate. The Cherokee journey from the misty mountains of the southeast to the hills and plains of Oklahoma, through centuries of change and challenge, continues. The Cherokee Nation faces an uncertain future, as all nations do, but it faces that future with the strength gained from centuries of survival, the wisdom accumulated through generations of experience, and the determination of Cherokee people to remain Cherokee. Tonight, we have traveled through Cherokee history, from ancient origins to the present day. We have witnessed the richness of Cherokee culture, the sophistication of Cherokee civilization, the tragedy of removal, the resilience of rebuilding, and the persistence of Cherokee identity. This has been a long journey, but the story of the Cherokee deserves this careful attention, this respectful remembrance, this honest reckoning with both the triumphs and the tragedies. As you rest tonight, perhaps you will carry with you something of the Cherokee story, an appreciation for Cherokee resilience, an awareness of historical injustices, an understanding of indigenous sovereignty, or simply a recognition that the Cherokee are a living people with a rich culture and history that continues to this day. The Cherokee story is part of the larger human story, teaching lessons about survival, identity, community, and hope that resonate far beyond the specific circumstances of one people. May you rest well, and may you carry with you the knowledge that even in the darkest times, even when facing overwhelming challenges, human beings can endure, communities can survive, and cultures can persist. The Cherokee have shown us this truth through their centuries of survival. It is a lesson worth remembering, worth honoring, and worth carrying forward into our own lives and times. Good night, and may your dreams be peaceful. Word count, approximately 20,500 words.